The hardest thing for me to do was forgive myself, and not necessarily feeling like the whole fault was on me, but forgiving myself for my piece of it, or forgiving myself for not honoring myself in times where I felt like I should have honored myself more. But it's just a part of the whole process, and the whole journey is of healing is just learning to forgive. Welcome to the Unique Conversations with Krys podcast, a podcast created to cultivate a place to have unique conversations about self-love, mental health, and the healing journey. A place where I believe that healing happens through storytelling. So thank you for joining us, and I'm looking forward to you joining the conversation. Before we begin today's episode, I want to pause and take a moment and just be honest with you before we start. So I was going through and editing the footage, and I got to the end, and I almost decided to scrap the entire thing. Now, it's not because of the video quality or the audio quality or the content. In fact, all those things were okay. The thing that almost made me scrap the entire thing is my fear of people getting the wrong idea about my demeanor throughout this episode. So, back in 2023, when I released my very first episode, I can't remember the day up to leading to me releasing the first one, me being absolutely terrified. I was nauseous. I was sick to my stomach. I almost backed out of doing the whole thing. And had it not been for the one person I was confiding in that encouraged me to continue to keep going, that my message would help others, I think I probably would have allowed fear to keep me from releasing that very first one. But here I am, 2 years later, and getting ready to release this next episode to you. Now, I mentioned my demeanor in this episode. What I recognized is that once I went beyond that fear that I was facing in 2023, and on the other side of that, me finding passion, purpose, and joy in creating these episodes and creating these conversations, that I didn't want my demeanor to come off as a person who has lost their passion or their joy for creating content or creating these conversations. It's quite the opposite. What you don't see, and I'll go into more detail in my next episode, is there were a lot of things physically that I was facing that I was trying to push through or power through in order to continue to create the conversations that I had and I want to share with you all. With that said, people that know me personally, or even once you get to know me, you can see a lot of what's going on with me and how I'm doing by my eyes, and whether or not I'm making eye contact or just little subtle nonverbal things. And so as I'm watching the footage, I'm recognizing that, man, I was really struggling and trying to push and project the same person that I'd been when I started this podcast in 2023. But what I did soon do, and the reason behind my absence for so long, is that after me trying to push through for the next few months, and I don't know whether or not I'm going to be able to release the other episodes that I had recorded throughout 2024, because out of all of the content that I recorded, this episode is actually one of the better days of me and the things that were going on with me physically. And so where I can, I will salvage and put out the episodes that I can. And then also, I'm also recording new conversations as well. But if this is your first time joining, or if you have not seen me in a while, I want to make sure I gave this disclaimer before we hop into this conversation.
If you have been a listener for a while, you are aware that I went through a divorce. And what I'd like to do is share some of the tools, tips, and strategies that I have learned as a part of this healing journey. If this is your first time, welcome. My name is Krys. I am the host, and this is Unique Conversations with Krys. This podcast was created with the intent of sharing my story in hopes that I would encourage or inspire someone else that maybe have gone through similar things that I did in my life so that they don't feel so alone. I've shared my battle with major clinical depression, from losing a sibling to navigating a divorce and other things that have occurred over my life. I also invite others to come share their story. And what that looks like is they'll come and we'll have a conversation about their life. The theme of this podcast is I want this to be a place to where it's a safe space. It's a safe space to where I've cultivated a community of individuals that will feel comfortable enough to come bear all of their story to me and others, all as a resource to help someone else. But one of the things that I've found as I've conducted these interviews is that just as equally as it is inspiring, encouraging to others, that it's also equally as healing to the person that's sharing the story, which I found myself as I shared my story. And one of the things that I say that my purpose and intent of my podcast is healing through storytelling. So that's some of what you'll see here on this podcast, or hear on this podcast, as well as I've invited subject matter experts, therapists, doctors, and other individuals that have a certain expertise in an area that can be beneficial to someone on either a healing journey or seeking information to get in a better place mentally, or just in overall personal growth. And so I hope that you are encouraged by the messages here. I encourage you to go check out my story as well as the story of others. And then also feel free. This is a place where I want it to feel like a community where we're having a conversation. So I want to hear from you. Today's conversation will be one of those where I talk about how I healed after my latest breakup. And I feel like these tips, tools, and strategies will be beneficial for anybody going through a major life transition, especially it doesn't always have to be a romantic breakup. It could be a friendship or even family. There's times where a family member can be so toxic that you choose to separate yourself from them. So one of the first strategies that I had to grieve it. I had to allow myself to feel all the feelings. Prior to me doing the work, I would stuff down any of the emotions that I was feeling towards a major life event. So the example that I used in my telling my story in my podcast, one of the first episodes, was that when I experienced the loss of my youngest sister, rather than me allowing myself to grieve, and even though I didn't have the tips, tools, and strategies, I think I was probably around 5 or 6 at the time that this happened. I didn't know what that meant to grieve, but even as I got older and I experienced other major losses and transitions in life, I typically would distract myself with either work, school, or any other activity so that I wouldn't have to feel that feeling of sadness or loss. So one of the things that I was really good about this time around is that I wanted to allow myself to feel all the feels. I wanted to allow myself to really grieve the loss of the relationship. And like I mentioned in the episode when I talked about my divorce, even though it doesn't matter the terms or the reasoning behind the divorce, it's still a loss. So I want to take a pause here. I recorded this episode last year, and as I'm editing the footage, I'm realizing that a huge part of the grief that I was feeling at the time was not mentioned here. Yes, a part of me grieved the fact that I would now longer be married. But a big part of that grief was not the relationship, it was what the relationship meant as far as my family. When I got married, my intent was to only get married once. And my intent, especially when I introduced children to the equation, is to have both of my children grow up with both of their parents in the home. And so when I was not able to achieve that in a healthy, happy relationship, there was a lot of grief on my part because I felt very guilty about me continuing the cycle of children growing up with divorced parents. So as I'm listening back, I want to make sure that I know that my grief wasn't the relationship. It was actually about grieving the loss of what I wanted initially for my children as far as a family. There's also the other side of that where you're having to grieve the future that you were anticipating with that person, or grieve the thoughts and ideas of having that successful relationship. Another thing that I did was I found people that I could confide in. And this is where I feel like community is so important. One of the main things was to have that support that would be consistent and a place where I could express myself, or someone that would hold me accountable. And I feel like that was crucial for me in order to successfully navigate this breakup without allowing it to break me or cause me to have a significant shift in my mental health. Another tip is making sure that you take care of yourself. Now, taking care of yourself could sound so cliche or something that may be overlooked, but don't undervalue and underestimate the benefits of taking care of yourself. So that's eating a healthy diet, that's getting enough sleep, that's getting up and moving around regularly, that is making sure that you're taking care of your spirit, body, mind, soul. If you go to any of my other podcast episodes where I've interviewed doctors and therapists, they have said something very similar to what I'm saying now. Making sure that your body, your mind, your spirit, your soul are all fed definitely help you be in a place to where you are able to withstand some of the most challenging or difficult days. Because one of the things you don't want to do on the other side of like taking care of yourself is cause more stress on your body by it being dehydrated, or the lack of sleep, or not getting enough food, in addition to whatever else you're going through. You want to put yourself in an environment, or create an environment to where you are giving yourself the best chance to have the best day or best week or best moment possible by making sure you're taking care of all of the underlying needs that your body has. Another tips that I feel like will be very beneficial is how to set boundaries. And it's not necessarily just setting boundaries with my ex. It was just making sure I set boundaries with myself. It's best for you to sit down and figure out what you need and address that person and set those boundaries. After a breakup, it may mean that you guys don't continue to talk and hang out like you were before the breakup, or it could mean that you stop following each other on social media. Relationship, each breakup will be unique and different, but the point is that you want to get to the place to where you figure out the boundaries, set the boundaries, and stick to those boundaries, so that way you both can have an environment to heal and get over the relationship. Another thing that I focused on during this transition and healing from a breakup is focusing on personal growth. Personal growth can mean going and getting a new skill. It can mean taking a new hobby, trying new things, reading books and listening to podcasts and watching videos, and anything that allows you to reflect and become a better version of you would be, for me, be considered personal growth. Where I was feeling like I was facing a difficult time, I used that energy and focused it back into me, so that way I am taking care of myself, and by making sure that I'm taking the time to do something that brings me joy. And that's the main point that I want to drive home, is that do things that bring you growth, bring you joy, inspires you, and that will allow you to shift the focus to where you're gaining a better relationship with yourself. Another thing that I had to remember and that I focused on throughout this time where I was navigating this was forgiveness, and not necessarily just forgiving the other person or waiting for that person to apologize, because that may or may not ever happen, but it's forgiving you for whatever you feel like the part that you owned up to it. The hardest thing for me to do was forgive myself, and not necessarily feeling like the whole fault was on me, but forgiving myself for my piece of it, or forgiving myself for not honoring myself in times where I felt like I should have honored myself more. But it's just a part of the whole process, and the whole journey is of healing is just learning to forgive. Next tips is seek professional help. There is a need for me sometimes to have that space, to have that person who is completely objective, who's not a friend, who's not going to have the same emotions that a good friend would have or a family member would have, to go and have them objectively listen to what I'm saying, provide the questions that would cause me to reflect and look at my perspective, challenge my perspective on some of the things, and then allow me to have a place to where I could decompress and let out all the frustrations, especially going through divorce. Anybody that's been in a divorce, whether it's high conflict, low conflict, mutual, non mutual, whatever the case it is, know that there's so many emotions that you experience from day to day that it can be a challenge. And one of the things that I did not want to do is exhaust my support team, even though the friends, the family members are awesome, they're great, they were a good foundation for support. But I still needed to have that place to where I could go and release and talk about some of the things, and have that person, that expert, help me navigate some of the challenging feelings that I was having, help me have a place to a sacred space to where I could go and talk to someone and have them walk me through some of the things that I was feeling. One of the things I'll always encourage anybody is to seek professional help, and that could be a counselor, a therapist, a minister, even a life coach, someone that has a skill set that can help you navigate some of those feelings and things throughout your breakup. And then I'll end with this, just like with grief, healing is feels like it's very episodic for me. So I could have 3 great days, and then I'll have a trigger or I'll have a moment, and it's suddenly feels like I'm back at square one. So the same thing applies with healing through a breakup. Is you may have a feel like you made a lot of progress, but then you take a couple of steps back. And so rather than focusing on feeling like you're not making any progress, just remember to keep one foot in front of the other. Just remember to take it one day at a time. I took the time to reflect and learn from the relationship. What that looks like is taking an inventory of what I brought to the relationship, what that person brought to the relationship, and just basically taking an inventory of what went well, what did not go well, how I could improve, how I can be a better partner next time, what I can look for in my next relationship, and just looking at it from the perspective. And in fact, someone brought this analogy, which I thought was awesome, is oftentimes, unless you're just one of the few people that, get one job and stick with a job until from the first time that you work till you retire, there are going to be chances that you either leave a job, get fired from a job, get laid off, whatever the case may be. One of the things that you do is, as you leave jobs or you transition jobs, most people, I would assume, would take a personal inventory and figure out what went well and what did not go well, what you'll look for the next position, and what your non-negotiables will be, what your red flags will be, all those things. So just like you would do all those things when you're looking at a job or career, I feel like the same thing could happen with in regards to relationships. Whether that's taking some time to do some healing shadow work, whether that's taking some time to, like I say, I always recommend therapy, but also taking the time to really reflect. And that could just look like journaling and talking about the relationship and figuring out what you want to attract for your next relationship, and then just taking ownership of things that you can improve. Like, I feel like we're always a work in process. So whether that's recognizing your attachment style and working on that attachment style, and then just remembering and being cognizant of the fact that although this one relationship didn't work, it does not reflect that you will always be alone or you'll always be single. It may be, for me, what I'm trying to really, so it's more or less recognizing that just because this one relationship failed does not mean that I am a failure or this I'm not good at relationships. It just means that it was time for this relationship to end, and now it's time to walk towards the journey, or continue on the journey towards the person that is meant for me to have, or meant for me to be with. And that's something to keep in mind too, is that there are billions of people in the world, and certainly there's going to be at least one other person that you connect with. Spending that time and reflecting on what can be improved, what you learn, lessons learned, could be a good thing between the relationships, so that, for one, for me, it allows me to stop, pause, and reflect, so that way I can recognize some of the patterns and bad habits that I have as far as partners that I choose or things that I do in relationships. And then two, it allows you to really get specific as to what you're seeking in your next relationship. And like I said, this doesn't necessarily have to be a romantic, it can be friendships. Friendship breakups can be just, if not more, devastating than a romantic relationship to breakups. I feel like having that moment and having that space, and that's why I feel like it's very important to not necessarily get out of one relationship or jump immediately into the next one, to kind of give yourself that breath, that pause, that time to reflect, so that way you're not carrying the same baggage into one relationship from the next. And two, that you're giving yourself that time and space to reflect and heal. So, just to go back over what I did, here are the steps that I used to heal from my latest breakup. I acknowledged the grief. I got support from my family and friends. I prioritized self care. I took care of myself. I set the appropriate boundaries for both myself and the other party that was involved in the breakup. I took the time to reflect and learn from the relationship. I focused on tasks that led to personal growth. I had to learn to forgive myself and the other person. I sought professional help, so a therapist, a counselor, coach, minister. So, with all those tips, I feel like hopefully this encourages someone that may be going through that rough patch of just now sitting in that place of uncomfortable in midst of a breakup. And I hope that those tips encourage you and help you on your healing journey. I hope that this conversation helped. I'm looking forward to the conversation to continue to go. So I'd love to hear from you. But until the next one, have a great one.